It is the last night of January, 1968, and Saigon is full of fireworks. They have been going since dark, strung from balconies and shop awnings, snapping in the heat, the smoke lying flat along the streets. This is the Lunar New Year, the holiday the whole country has been saving for all month. In this city, on this night, the sound of something exploding is the sound of a celebration. You are standing a post at the door of a rented building. The Army holds more than 100 of them here. Hotels and apartment blocks at least, and never gave back. Scattered through every quarter of the city, each with a guard at the entrance and a light above the door. 1,300 men hold every one of them. There is no wall around any of them. There is no perimeter. There is no line anywhere on the map where this city stops being the rear. That is the thing worth understanding about Saigon in January of 1968. The war is somewhere else. It is up on the plateau at Khe Sanh, out in the highlands, down among the canals of the delta. It is a place you fly to. Here there is traffic, and money changing hands, and ice that has to be delivered before it melts, and a curfew, and a very great deal of paperwork. And tonight there are firecrackers, and they have been so loud for so long that you have stopped hearing them before we settle in. If these have been helping you get to sleep, subscribing keeps them coming, and it costs you nothing at all. And I am always curious where everybody is listening from. Leave your city and what time it is where you are. I do read them. Now get comfortable. Straighten the pillow. Turn the light down. Whatever is still on your mind, set it down for a couple of hours. Because for the next 2 hours, you are in one city, on one ordinary shift, on a night that everyone there expected to stay quiet. We start with how you got here. The door of the aircraft opens and the heat is already standing in the frame, filling it the way a wall fills a doorway. You have to walk through it to get down onto the concrete. It is not a gust, and it does not pass off. It is simply the ordinary temperature of the place. And from this minute onward, it is the atmosphere you are living inside. The temperature here hardly moves. It sits near 84 degrees Fahrenheit and stays there, month after month, with very little seasonal swing in either direction. The records of that year do not describe your first minute on the ground. They count runways and cargo, and days at sea, not men coming down a set of steps. But they do keep the temperature, and the temperature is the thing that met you. The field is Tan Son Nhut, and it is the official port of entry into the country. Before 1965, only 3 airfields in all of Vietnam could accommodate jet aircraft, and 2 of those 3 were positioned on either side of this city, here and over at Bien Hoa. Even by the middle of 1966, there were only 6 in the entire country, and only 3 of those possessed high-intensity lighting. As a measurement of the aviation available, the national airline owned 13 aircraft in 1965, and not one of them was a jet. So almost everything that entered the country by air entered it where you are standing. Mail, freight, couriers, replacements. Whatever arrived through this gate was sorted here and distributed onward from here. And that includes you. The distance behind you was measured in those years, in weeks. A merchant ship out of the eastern seaboard of the United States took 34 days to reach the Republic of Vietnam. That was the first thing the engineers wrote down about the country when they had to say how far away it was. Of the business of receiving a man into the country, the paperwork keeps very little. In the reception centers of the combat units, a dental examination had become part of processing a man in by then, and whatever had been neglected earlier was treated immediately. But those were the reception centers of combat units, and they were not anywhere near here. The one documented reception complex of that description sat up the coast at Kamran, off by itself, with a rehabilitation center and a hospital establishment beside it. Nothing of the kind is recorded for this city. What you are handed is small, a card the size of the one in your wallet, carrying the obligations of the American forces toward prisoners of war. Every man arriving in the country was issued one. You have arrived in the dry half of the year. Summer weather, as the engineers put it, prevails here from November to the middle of March. The rains belong to May through October and can deliver 58 inches of water in a season, and none of that is occurring at present. What is occurring is the northeast monsoon, descending out of the interior of Asia and laying a clear sky and a dry heat across the southern half of the country. The same book says what that season does to the land. The dry season turns the countryside into a hot, still oven. Dust rises off everything that moves: helicopters, aircraft, trucks, earth-moving machinery, and works its way into everything else. And the heat is not written down as weather. It is written down as a load. Heat debilitates troops, the engineers wrote, and work slows down, and it is expected to slow you down as well, for a while, until the acclimatizing is behind you. Your body will take about 6 weeks to arrive. That figure comes from a brigadier general of the medical service, who named the causes together: the shift of your daily rhythm, the change of climate, and a stomach upset in the first weeks. After that, the rate of such complaints among acclimatized men falls away to almost nothing. So you are expected to be unwell for a while, and nobody around you is surprised by it. Men came through on 12-month tours, which meant that unacclimatized arrivals never stopped coming, and the rate of these complaints stayed high across the entire length of the war. Acclimatization was described as a psychological and cultural business as well, and not every man came through that part of it successfully. A year is what you have. Men on the staff of the command headquarters served 12 months, and the Marine Corps served 13. There is a reason you are inside the city rather than outside it, and by 1968 that was already the exception rather than the arrangement. In early 1967, the command began a campaign to reduce the American presence in the larger cities, this one above all. The program was administered by the logistics section of the headquarters staff, and it was given a code name: Moose. It stood for Move Out of Saigon Expeditiously. The moving was genuine. The engineer command had already relocated from Tan Son Nhut to Bien Hoa at the end of 1966. By the middle of 1967, roughly half the Army personnel in the city had gone out to the complex at Long Binh, and the headquarters of the Army in Vietnam announced its own departure there in the July of that year, while the builders were still finishing the buildings. The men who remained were mostly at Tan Son Nhut, or else performing work that had to be done within reach of the airfield or of the headquarters. That is the entire explanation for you, and no biography is required to accompany it. If you are living inside this city in January of 1968, you are living here because the assignment you were given is attached to it. The unit you have been assigned to is the 716th Military Police Battalion. What it does is guard and police, and the ground it answers for is not an installation and not a perimeter. It is a city, the one on the other side of the door you just walked through, continuing about its business in the heat. with the war happening somewhere else entirely. The city stands on a river, about 40 miles up from the sea, and that is the whole reason it is where it is. In all of South Vietnam, this was the only place a deep-water port was needed, and the only place one existed, and the engineers listed that one harbor among the formidable obstacles in front of them, alongside the climate and the absence of local building material. Everything the war brought in by ship came up that river. The river is working water, not scenery. Junks and sampans and steamers come down from the upper reaches and out of the Mekong, along channels dredged through swamp and paddy, to tie the Mekong branches to the Saigon. It is a road that happens to be wet. Around the city, there is almost no other city. South Vietnam held 17.5 million people. 80% of them spread among district towns and 44 provincial capitals. Saigon is one of very few urban points in a country, otherwise made of farmland and village. The city is cut into precincts, named in the records from the 1st through the 18th. The 1st precinct holds the American Embassy, which is to say, the center. The 8th is the southwest corner, south of the river, with the 6th and the 7th beside it. Cholon is the western half of the whole thing, and out at its western edge stands the Phu Tho racetrack, the only large covered space in the city, and the only ground inside it big enough to land aircraft on. On the Vietnamese side, the same ground is the capital military district, a security zone taking in Saigon and 5 neighboring districts of Gia Dinh province. The defense and security of Saigon were delegated by the commander of the 3rd Corps to the commander of that district. The city is defended on paper by the Vietnamese. The president's own palace guard sits here too. The 1st Airborne Battalion at Camp Le Vendouillet in the heart of Saigon, and a capital is governed rather than fought over, which shows in the rules for firing a weapon inside it. Artillery, helicopter gunships, tactical aircraft, anything of that sort had to be cleared by the district chief, and inside Saigon by the chief of the precinct, and only then by the district commander through his control center. 2 chains of approval, one political and one military, before a single shell. The American buildings sit in and around all of this. The command post of the Military Assistance Command went up next to the airfield at Tan Son Nhut, and men called it the Pentagon East, 2-story prefabricated buildings with cooled working space for 4,000, and with them housing, communications, mortar shelters, fencing, and guard towers. The Army's own headquarters is not in the city at all. It is at Long Binh, 16 miles out, 25 square miles of ground, room for 50,000 soldiers, more than $100 million spent. Those are the 2 distances to hold on to. The theater command sits at the edge of the city, and the Army headquarters sits 16 miles outside it. 2 jet airfields flank the city, Tan Son Nhut on one side and Bien Hoa on the other, each an enormous installation with 10,000 feet of runway. All of it grew fast and untidily. In March of 1965, the only ammunition depot in the country stood at Tan Son Nhut. By the end of that same year, there were 8. In those first years, the merchandise of the exchange was being held in 13 separate places in Saigon alone, for want of a warehouse to put it in. Traffic through the city runs at what the men who police it call a tremendous volume, and what moves in that volume the paperwork describes sideways, by what could be concealed inside it. Weapons and explosives came into Saigon in 3-wheeled carts and private cars, tucked under clothing and produce. Taxis and small buses were so ordinary a part of the night that a vehicle rolling up to a building was not a thing anyone looked at twice. Your own driving is done under Vietnamese traffic law, and money is the other law you live under. By 1968, an American in Vietnam did not handle dollars at all. From the 1st of September 1965, United States forces were paid only in military payment certificates, and American civilian firms in the country dealt only in certificates or piastres. The certificates are scrip. The United States prints them and they pass as money on every American installation. The one thing they could not be turned into was green dollars, which had been taken out of this economy on purpose. Piastres you got by trading certificates at an official exchange for authorized purchases of Vietnamese goods and services. Money going home moves in 3 shapes: an allotment paid to a person or a bank account, a money order over a counter, or a checking account at an American bank. Anything cashed inside Vietnam is paid out in certificates again, and from 1966, no money order could be bought for more than a month of your own pay. With the pay record produced at the counter and the names at both ends written down. The reason for all of it was inflation. The war had brought the country a runaway version of it. The piastre kept losing value, and the market rate for a dollar stood well above the official rate the two governments had agreed between them. So the rules existed to hold the two money systems apart, to choke off currency manipulation, and to lift some of that weight off the Vietnamese economy. Purchases judged excessive were reported to the revenue authorities back home. The men who wrote the rules also wrote down honestly that all of it made such dealings harder without ending them. What value looked like here is the list of goods the exchange had to ration in 1966. Cigarettes and cameras, electric fans and record players, radios and typewriters and watches. Small, expensive, easily passed along, and not available on the Vietnamese market at all. The street you walk down has been tidied once already. In November of 1966, the Prime Minister warned the street vendors of Saigon that illegal sales would no longer be tolerated. The warning was ignored, and the Vietnamese police went out and broke up the stalls and took the goods. Some were trading again before the end of the year, but the expensive things were no longer out where you could see them, so you live inside 3 laws at once. And the directive names them for you. You carry immunity from Vietnamese criminal and civil jurisdiction under international agreement, and you are also required to obey Vietnamese law, where it does not conflict with military requirements. Compliance, the directive says, is particularly important in the areas of traffic, curfew, and currency regulations. There is a procedure even for being stopped. You comply, and you notify the military police or your commander. A Vietnamese ticket or summons goes to your commander. At an accident, you give your name and unit to the national policeman investigating it and to the injured party, and take the same details from the other side. Traffic, curfew, currency. That is the shape of the city as the rules draw it. Where you may drive, when to be indoors, what you may spend. Nowhere in any of it is there a line about holding the building you sleep in. The war is a thing that happens somewhere else, out in the provinces. And this is the city men come back to from it. The place where you sleep has no gate. There is no wire around it, no cleared ground, no line where the post ends and the country starts. You sleep in a billet, and a billet in this city is a building the army has rented. A hotel, a walk-up, a villa behind a low wall, with the street on the other side of the plaster. and on that street other people's houses and other people's business. The number is written down, and it is the shape of the arrangement. The battalion of military police that held the city put it in its own report. More than 100 buildings used as officers' quarters and as enlisted quarters, standing in clusters and in isolated positions throughout all sections of the city. The report calls this a problem peculiar to Saigon. It is not describing a camp with a soft spot in the fence. It is describing 100 separate places with no fence at all. Between one of those buildings and the next, there is nothing military whatever. No sector of fire, no wire to walk at dusk, no ground you are responsible for. There is a block of the city, and then another block, and somewhere past them a second building with the same problem, held by men who cannot see you and cannot help you. None of it was built for this. Across the country, the Americans held at one time more than 900 leased properties, from large hotels down to small separate villas, along with cold storage rooms, warehouses, and wharves. In the capital, almost everything a soldier lived in was rented from a Vietnamese owner. The renting was done badly, and the record admits it. The need was urgent, which made it a seller's market. Few officers were trained to negotiate a lease, and there was no time to negotiate slowly. Physical security, the account says, was always questionable, and landlords were not above making use of the position their tenants were in. Hundreds of leases came out poorly drawn, expensive, and poorly recorded. Rent was paid in piastres, out of the operating funds of whichever office had asked for the building. The length of occupancy was set down as indefinite. Every request for property reserved the right to demolish or abandon anything built on it. Your bed had a price in a ledger, so much per man per month, and the rate was reviewed once a year. One address survives in enough detail to stand for the rest. Bachelor Officers' Quarters No. 3 was a villa, the residence of senior American officers, standing across an alley from Gate 5 of the Joint General Staff compound. A sentry from the Military Police Battalion stood outside it, on the alley, with a radio. Houses faced him. A main boulevard ran 2 turns away. There is a list that says where a bed stood in the order of things. The engineers kept 55 construction priorities for Vietnam, ranked. Clearing troop areas came first. Water points came fourth. Enlisted billets came 42nd and lower. Behind shower points, post offices, exchanges, bakeries, and clubs. Officers' quarters came in the 50s. Chapels came last. Cool air was policy, and the policy was not about you. The climate was held to justify air conditioning in administrative and headquarters spaces, in certain medical facilities, and in the quarters of air crews who flew at night, of senior officers, and of civilians. A man standing a static post was not on that list. The command had to put control numbers on air conditioners to keep them where they belonged. Units were pulling the machines out of hospitals and data centers into living quarters, clubs, and orderly rooms, and the record names the practice as widespread. What came instead came through the exchange and through parcels from home. Fans, hot plates, small refrigerators, televisions, until the demand for power ran ahead of the supply of it. Outside the door there is a kiosk. That is the physical fact of a static post. A half circle of reinforced concrete, 8 inches thick, with a metal roof on supports. By the end of October of 1966, 102 of them had been put up, with 200 planned, and the battalion wrote that the protection they gave was a positive factor in the morale of men assigned to static guard. It is a doorway made survivable. It is not a perimeter, and nobody called it one. What moves between the buildings after dark is a Jeep. A quarter-ton truck with the windshield taken off and replaced by a single layer of sandbags. 2 men in it, one with a machine gun and one driving, a radio between them. 9 assigned patrol districts across the city. Armor plate was fitted to the sides and the rear. From above, the battalion noted, the vehicle stayed extremely vulnerable. The people asleep in the 100 buildings were not part of any of this. In the battalion's own words, personnel residing in these structures were not equipped to defend themselves. What they had found. Weapons of different types and descriptions, drawn from different sources. How much room a man was supposed to have is written down in the Army's own manual. And the manual was written in 1957, for barracks, not for a rented house in a foreign capital. 60 to 72 square feet a man, where beds stood closer than 5 feet apart. Men were to sleep head to foot, so 2 faces were never breathing into each other. Nobody measured this city against that. What a proper camp cost was written down to. Per man, $940 a head at the temporary standard, which bought the roads, the messes, the showers, the dispensary, and the post office. None of it was built here. Here there was a lease and a landlord. That a billet could be a target was not a new idea. The battalion's own disaster plan took as its working example the bombing of an American billet on the pattern of the Victoria Hotel, and set out what would follow. On word from the provost marshal, an alert party of 25 men. Years before, a large downtown hotel used to quarter officers had been bombed on Christmas Eve, one of the earliest attacks aimed at Americans alone. The guards themselves slept no better than the guarded. 3 of the battalion's 5 companies lived in one billeting complex, with a single way in and out, cramped parking, 1 access road, and 1 narrow exit. Their commander called the place extremely poor and untenable, and asked that it be vacated altogether. If the billets were destroyed or seized, he wrote, 3/5 of the battalion would be cut off. There was a program meant to fix all of this, and its name was an instruction. Move out of Saigon expeditiously. It went hard. Before a unit could leave, someone had to find a place outside the city where the same work could be done, and commanders did not want to sit far from the headquarters they served. When one office gave up its leased space, another office that had been crowded moved into it. By the middle of 1967, about half the Army personnel in the capital had gone out to the base complex up the road. Half the people left. The posts did not. The battalion recorded that its static security requirements, which in theory should have gone down as the program went forward, showed no appreciable change at all. The same doors, the same alleys, the same 100 roofs, covered every evening by fewer men, and to be covered again the next morning. The work has a name written into a report, and the name is not a battle. Security and law enforcement in the Saigon, Cholon, and Tan Son Nhut area. That is the mission, quarter after quarter, in the battalion's own file. It reads like the charter of a city police force, which is close to what it was. Defending the city belonged to the Vietnamese. Order inside it belonged to you. 1,300 military policemen held that area. Few of them had ever been in combat, and none had been trained to fight in a city, because fighting in a city was not what they had been sent for. They carried rifles. The battalion owned a few light machine guns. and its only heavy weapons were a handful of 90mm recoilless rifles. And it was still the only American ground unit in Saigon with any fighting capability at all. Most of that work is standing still. About 83% of the battalion's military police and security guards went to fixed places and stayed at them. The embassy, the new headquarters complex, the quarters of generals and senior visitors, the officers and enlisted quarters, and buildings marked as critical. 2 years earlier, it had been about 70%. The job was drifting towards standing and away from moving. The purpose of that standing is set down plainly: to deter acts of terror, overt and covert. Not to hold a line, not to break an attack, to make one man with a package think twice about your door. The rest is police work anyone would know. Normal military police duties in a city, criminal cases among them, done for a provost marshal at an area headquarters. Above that, the chain ran to a police group and then a brigade, and the battalion said flatly that this channel worked. By that winter, the unit was 5 companies and a headquarters detachment, with one company out at the annex by the airfield, not downtown. A guard company was being taken apart as you served. One platoon, an officer and 49 men, went across to a lettered company. The patrol truck is a 1/4 ton, and its small facts are the job. Rifle racks were made in the battalion shop out of inch-angle iron and 1/4-inch rod, set between the front seats to hold 2 rifles where the driver could reach them without losing the wheel. 17 were built, and no more, because the iron and the rod ran out. Armor plate on those trucks was argued out honestly. It cut the risk from fire on the flanks and gave crews confidence, which the battalion counted as real. Against it, the weight broke drive shafts and wheel bearings. The plate cracked. A grenade thrown inside was worse, not better, with the sides closed in, and the driver saw less of the street. Everything on a post runs on a radio, and the radios were thin. Roughly 100 sets served the guard net by that January. Half of them an older model short of power and range in a built-up city. Some posts could not reach the switchboard until their antennas were carried outside. Buildings and power lines drank the signal. Those sets did not arrive because somebody thought a guard ought to have a radio. 100 of them were placed on the static posts and at the critical buildings ahead of the Vietnamese national elections of September 1966. The posts were wired for one date and kept the wiring afterwards. The rule behind that complaint is 1 line long. A man on a static post must be able to reach the military police desk. Without the desk, he is not a guard, only a man in a doorway with a rifle, unable to tell anyone what he can see. A shift began and ended with a conversation. The battalion rewrote its own regulation that quarter, so every company named an intelligence officer whose duty was to brief each man going on duty and question each man coming off it. The old method had been a list of more than 100 things to look for, handed over and forgotten, and the report says what it produced: little or nothing. The new aim was smaller and better set, to get the troops into the habit of seeing and reporting. And the men were owed something back. The battalion took on a monthly summary made mostly of what its own guards and patrols brought in. So the man who reported a parked truck could later read what the truck had been. Between shifts there was school, and less of it every year. 13 days went to range firing that quarter, against 83 2 years before. The required minimum for other classes was 4 hours a week, cut in half from 8. The posts were eating the training. The list of subjects is the day itself, said out loud. Escort of senior visitors, map reading, protection of a crime scene, riot and civil disorder. 2 years earlier, that list had also carried basic Vietnamese, relations with the national police, and Vietnamese road signs. The Jeep beside yours may not be American. The Joint Patrol was a real unit and not a slogan. One vehicle carrying United States Military Police and Vietnamese National Police together, working the same streets. It stood in law as well as in practice. After a traffic accident, an American gave his name and unit to the national policeman handling it, or to the Joint Patrol, and took the same back. It cut the other way as well. An American could not be tried in a Vietnamese court, but he was bound by Vietnamese law all the same, and the instruction if a Vietnamese policeman stopped him was flat. Comply. Give your name and unit in full. Go to the station if asked. Never resist by force. Reported afterwards. In January, the Provost Marshal's list of Americans and third country civilians whose privileges had been taken away held 75 names. The two forces traded language for language. The battalion put 2 men full-time into the National Police Training Center to teach English, near 140 hours of class a month. And the Vietnamese lent 2 teachers of their own to the Americans who rode the Joint Patrol. The same tie ran through the precincts in ways that had nothing to do with police work, and the battalion was honest about what that bought. Its intelligence officer worked the civic program at precinct level, and through precinct chiefs and ordinary policemen came word that reached no one any other way. Then there is traffic, most of the day for most of the men. In that quarter, the battalion's people drove more than 650,000 miles inside one city and had 36 accidents, none of them fatal. Not high, the report says, for the volume of traffic. Points where traffic is worked by hand counted as their own burden, alongside extra guards and escorts. There was not one case of malaria in the battalion or in any unit attached to it that quarter, which is the clearest measure that this was a city and not a field. And the day ends where it began, with a man asking what you saw. What you saw goes onto a form. The form goes into a summary, and the summary comes back next month with your own 100 meters of street in it, written down by somebody else. A city held together by paper, your papers, their papers, the papers of everyone who walks past your door, and one man at each door who knows only his own stretch of it. Heist does not keep. That is the whole of its nature. And in a tropical city, it is the fact that arranges everything else around it. A block of ice in Saigon had to be made somewhere, loaded, carried across town, and handed over before it turned back into water. Almost everything the garrison ate and drank obeyed some version of that rule. The Army did not call it food. In the supply tables and the quarterly reports, it was Class 1, a class of supply like fuel or ammunition, with its own directorate and its own place in the queue. Your dinner was a commodity moving through a system with priorities that were not about dinner. There were 3 names for what that commodity could be. The A ration was perishable, fresh and frozen meat, fresh fruit and vegetables, dairy, and it needed cold at every step of the journey. The B ration was cooked from tinned and dry components, with nothing fresh in it. The third was the meal combat, individual, a packaged meal which does not require refrigeration. This is one of the places the Army named when it wrote down where troops lived on A rations. Units in areas such as Saigon, Cam Ranh Bay, and Vung Tao subsisted upon rations including fresh fruits, vegetables, and milk, in accordance with the monthly continental United States master menu. You ate hot food made from fresh ingredients, off a menu written for another country. The record gives the other half a few pages later, and it is the more honest one. Attempts were made to follow that menu in certain areas of Vietnam, but this was difficult due to limited refrigeration facilities. Not plenty then. A menu the city very nearly kept up with. Whoever cooked for you was probably not from your own unit. Laundry, bath, bakery, and mess were furnished on a territorial basis by whoever held that piece of ground and not down the chain from your own battalion. The mess itself was a building with its own line in the engineers' construction standards at a time when quarters of the same grade were still tents. Food arrived by ship into a port the Americans did not run. The port was a commercial harbor under the Port Authority of the Republic of Vietnam, and which of its 10 deep draft berths American cargo would get was settled from one day to the next. That is why there was a second port. Newport, on the river above the city, was 9 months old that January. What the city did not have was a cold store of its own. Permanent refrigerated warehouses were built elsewhere in the country and never here, so the cold you ate out of was rented, moored, and improvised. Leased commercial space, banks of refrigerated boxes, barges lying offshore, and a few cold rooms left behind by the French. Your supper spent its last night in somebody else's building. One sentence in the record explains the arrangement. Perishable items in Vietnam were phased into the menu faster than storage, and handling could be provided. Then, a few months before the holiday, the cold began arriving in containers of its own. From October of 1967, a shipping line ran refrigerated vans into Vietnam on a 15-day cycle, of which 60 came onto Saigon. Each van was a refrigerator in its own right, running on bottled gas or plugged into a power source. You could see it on the line that winter. Things that had never survived the passage were there in quantity: lettuce, pears, tomatoes, melons, issued straight out of the van into the ration truck and onto your tray a day or two later. The milk in your glass was local, from a plant that had been running in the city since December of 1965. When food did not arrive, the reasons were set down without embarrassment. The distances were long, the monsoon took up the transport, and perishable cargo was displaced from time to time by cargo of higher priority. Fresh meat lost its place to ammunition. The man who decided whether you could eat a thing was an Army veterinarian. Food inspection belonged to the veterinary service, whose stated business was preventing the consumption of unwholesome food, and nothing could be bought except from an approved source. By 1967, 39 Vietnamese shops and plants had been approved, and the yardstick was one question: does it endanger the health of the soldier? The bakeries worked at night, which made watching them rare even in Saigon, and the managers explained the hours by saying that Viet Cong tax collectors made their rounds in the dark. So the inspectors checked the result instead, cutting into loaves and rolls as they were delivered. Water was its own campaign. Nearly all the surface water needed treatment, so the answer became drilling. Deep wells inside the compounds, needing nothing but chlorination, aiming at 50 gallons per man per day. The chlorine standard was heavy and strictly enforced: 5 parts per million of free residual chlorine at the water point, 2 parts per million by the time you drank it. All of it comes back to ice. Ice was in enormous demand because of the hot, muggy climate, and demand of that kind does not wait on an approved source. If approved ice was not to be had, you bought it from the nearest Vietnamese vendor, not out of appetite, but for something cold to drink in a city where the air did not cool down. The Army solved that the only way it could, by making the local ice legal. Purchase was permitted from those Vietnamese ice plants that chlorinated their water to at least 5 parts per million, and because unapproved ice kept turning up for sale, every block was marked as it was delivered. A tag on a block of ice, the whole apparatus of inspection reduced to one thing you could look at while you paid. There was never enough. Local production was limited, so the Army shipped in 40 ice plants in a single year, each rated at 15 tons a day. The rating stayed theoretical. The men running them had not been trained, and what came out was always less than the plate said. How much you needed had been worked out in an Army manual years before the war, and the arithmetic held. Above 95 degrees, the body cools by evaporation alone, and in wet air the sweat runs off the skin instead of evaporating. The planning figure for drinking in the tropics was 6 quarts a day. Whatever else you drank or ate, you bought. The exchange here was older than the war, trading there since 1956, and the clubs drew on the same supply stream as the service messes did. Alongside the soap, the writing paper, and the cigarettes, the exchange sold liquor, radios, televisions, stereo equipment, diamonds, and furs. The grocery was harder to get into. There were 2 commissaries in all of Vietnam, one in Saigon and one at Long Binh, and in 1968 the rule tightened. The shops were kept for those with no organized mess in their area, which meant not for you. What came instead came by mail order: small refrigerators, hot plates, toasters, coffee makers. So the cold in that city was never owned, only kept up. It came off a ship every 15 days, waited in somebody else's warehouse, went out again on a truck, and a block of it lasted exactly as long as it lasted. Through the last week of January, the trucks ran and the blocks arrived tagged. That last week was a holiday week, and the city had been getting ready. The year did not turn for one person at a time. It turned for everyone at once, at midnight, on a night set by the moon rather than by a calendar hanging on a wall. And in 1968 that night fell at the end of January. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and it is the largest thing in the Vietnamese year. The whole country arrives at the same hour together. It was a sacred holiday, a time for the renewal of bonds with family and ancestors, and for preparation for the year ahead. That is how the Americans described it in their own histories, and it is worth taking at its word, because it explains what the city looked like in the last week of January. This was not a public occasion that people attended. It was a private one that everybody kept at the same time. The celebration ran a week, and the record lists what a week of it contained. Much feasting, gift-giving, the shooting of fireworks, and reunion with family and friends. Each of those is a small logistical fact in its own right. Food had to be bought and cooked, presents had to be found, and people had to travel, sometimes a long way, to be with the family they intended to be with when the year changed. Firecrackers were legal at Tet, which meant a city that could make as much noise as it wanted to and fully intended to. The record puts the sound of the holiday in one line: crowds and exploding firecrackers. Legally available this Tet after years of a government ban. That is the only description of the noise the documents give. And it is enough. The garrison kept the holiday too, in its own way. On the 28th of January, the 716th Military Police Battalion put on a Lunar New Year party for 1,000 Boy Scouts of the Saigon police force. The same battalion had given the same children a Christmas tree 5 weeks earlier, on the 23rd of December. 3 days before the end of January, the unit that held the city was handing out food and presents to children. The holiday also stopped the war, or was supposed to. Tet, like Christmas and the Western New Year, had been an occasion for temporary truces throughout the long war. Both sides had used those pauses to regroup and to bring up supplies, and neither side had often used them for major attacks. A truce at Tet was not an experiment. It was a habit with several years behind it. The one arranged for 1968 was negotiated down before it began. It had been planned to run 48 hours. The South Vietnamese argued that tradition and morale obliged them to give their troops a break at Tet, which nobody disputed, but they agreed to shorten the pause from 48 hours to 36. On the 24th of January, General Westmoreland and Ambassador Bunker recommended that there be no truce at all in the Northern Corps area and over the southern part of North Vietnam. Their reasoning was arithmetic rather than principle. Even 36 hours of standing still would hand advantages that could not be afforded. The announcement of that cancellation was deliberately held back until midday on the 29th, the very day the truce was to take effect. For the rest of the country, the window was fixed and narrow. The truce would run from 6 in the evening on the 29th of January to 6 in the morning on the 31st. It began on schedule at 6 in the evening across the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Corps areas. Saigon sat inside that window, and so did you. The announcement of the exception went wrong in a small and very human way. The South Vietnamese were supposed to announce the northern cancellation first, and they did not, because their press office had closed for the holiday. The American mission put out a statement of its own instead, late in the afternoon. The holiday had already begun to take pieces of the machinery offline, one office at a time. Then, on the morning of the 30th, the truce ended before it had finished. At 9:45, President Thieu formally canceled it throughout South Vietnam. What had been 36 hours became a day and a bit, and the pause that the year turned inside of was withdrawn from the army that had asked for it. The other half of the holiday was leave, and that had been settled 19 days earlier, or was supposed to have been. On the 11th of January, the Joint General Staff directed South Vietnamese commanders to limit Tet leave to no more than 5% of their strength. 5 in 100. It is a small allowance, and it was meant to be. The order did not hold. Outside the Northern Corps area, up to 50% of the soldiers of most units were absent for the holiday, with or without authorization. Half. In the north, where the threat was closer and the truce had been called off earlier, units stood nearer to full strength, and even there more than 20% of the men were away. A second measurement, taken independently, agrees. Men absent from their units for the Tet truce had lowered the strength of the South Vietnamese army by the 20th of January to about half of what it was authorized to have. That is 10 days before the holiday itself. The men had begun leaving well before the pause officially started. When the truce was canceled on the 30th, the Joint General Staff sent recall messages to its units. They went out at the last minute, and most of them did not arrive where they were aimed. The Vietnamese communication system could not reach the bulk of those soldiers, who were by then wherever their families were. The American garrison had a smaller version of the same arithmetic to solve. Many of the buildings it guarded were watched by Vietnamese civilian guards, and those guards were entitled to the holiday like anybody else. For the Tet period, the 716th Military Police Battalion was required to furnish additional guards of its own to stand in for the civilians who were away on authorized absence. The battalion recorded the effect on its own operations in a single flat sentence. The number of additional personnel involved did not seriously affect them. A post that a civilian had held became, for the week of the holiday, a post held by a military policeman. It was a substitution, written down and staffed, of the kind that a battalion makes several times a year. So the city arranged itself for the turn of the year. Families traveled to be with each other, as they did every year at this holiday and at no other. You guarded some doors that were not usually yours. The battalion you belonged to had given a party for 1,000 children 2 days before. And the last of the old year was being spent the way the last of a year is spent. And on the evening of the 30th of January, the year had still not turned. It would turn at midnight, the same midnight for the woman closing her shop, for the family setting out the food, for the Vietnamese soldier a long way from his unit, and for you, standing where you had been put. 1 hour, arriving for all of them at once. A report is a piece of paper that arrives on a desk. Someone reads it, weighs it against the other paper of that week, and sets it on a stack. The stack is not a failure. It is what a stack is for. Every army that ever fought has kept one, and the work is mostly deciding which page goes on top of it this morning. By the middle of January, there was a great deal of paper. Through December and into the new year, the evidence had built that the Viet Cong meant to go after the population centers around Saigon. Battalions had struck at district towns north and west of the city. Main force regiments had been seen moving toward the capital. Local battalions were being filled out with soldiers sent down from the north, and they carried newer weapons than the year before. Automatic rifles and shoulder-fired rocket launchers. Prisoners taken outside the city said the local companies were preparing to lead main force units against the capital itself. That is a clear sentence. It is also the kind of sentence prisoners had been saying in one form or another for a very long time, and every week brought more of them. On the 27th of January, at the weekly intelligence meeting, the command's chief of intelligence told the room that a major offensive was being prepared, and that it would be countrywide. He did not name targets beyond those already on the list, and he did not give a date. That was not evasion. It was what the paper supported. But a warning with no place in it and no hour in it is one that every officer has to carry back to his own desk and turn into something he can do. The next day, in a coastal city north of Saigon, South Vietnamese military police picked up 11 men. Under questioning, they said what the 2 prisoners had said. The plan was to go into the cities during the holiday. They were carrying 2 recorded tapes made to be played over radio stations once those had been taken. The tapes announced that revolutionary forces had taken Saigon, Hue, and Da Nang, and called on the people to rise. Tapes like that had a long history behind them. For years, the captured documents had promised a general uprising, and for years it had not come. The assessment written long afterward put the problem exactly. The men reading the paper did not picture this enemy as able to do what his own propaganda said he would do. So the call to rise read as encouragement rather than as a drawing of what was coming. In the last days of the month, 2 intelligence agencies in Washington each put out a memorandum. Both said broad, coordinated attacks were being prepared. Both hedged on whether the thing would truly be nationwide, and both judged that the likeliest time for it to start was after the holiday rather than during it. That last line carried the weight, and it looks like nothing on the page. After, not during, a difference of 2 or 3 days, written in the careful voice men use when they are honest about what they cannot know. One report never arrived at all. About a week before the holiday, the South Vietnamese Security Service took a senior Viet Cong cadre in the Saigon area, and he confirmed that a general offensive was being prepared. The service kept it because Vietnamese intelligence organizations guarded their material jealously, from each other as much as from anyone, and it never passed the report up to the Joint Staff. It never reached the American command. Then the thing began to announce itself. Soon after midnight on the 30th, units in the core areas to the north attacked their cities a full day early, apparently because their orders had gone crooked somewhere along the way. By 7 that morning, the chief of intelligence had told the commanding general what he thought it meant. The same would happen that night and the following morning, all over the country. In the coastal city where the 11 men had been picked up, the province chief closed his town. He put a curfew on it, and he forbade firecrackers. He saw to it that the checkpoints and the outposts on the approaches were fully manned. Before dawn on the 30th, the town was entered anyway, and one of its main objectives changed hands. In Saigon, no such order was given. What the day did produce in Saigon was a set of ordinary, sensible measures. The military district responsible for defending the city put all its troops into barracks and tightened its hold on the main roads coming in, too late in the day to matter much. It was given an airborne battalion, and 2 of its companies went to guard a large prison and the national radio station, while the other 2 stayed at district headquarters in reserve. In the center of the city, the field police took up defensive positions at the important intersections. Out at the airfield, the Air Force security units that normally watched the base went onto alert, and by pure accident, extra paratroopers were on the field that night, waiting for a lift to Da Nang in the morning. East of the city, the American field force had been on alert since the 29th. The defenses at Bien Hoa thickened, its staff rehearsing what they would do if the airfield were hit. The one place not strengthened at all was the headquarters itself. The close-in defense of the American command's own building was a chain-link fence, military police guard towers, and a set of checkpoints, and nobody made any real attempt to add to it. In the corridors there was talk that the building might be hit. The talk did not turn into sandbags. When the offices emptied that evening, officers in senior and sensitive jobs went home to their villas around the city, lightly guarded the way rented houses are. Some took weapons along. The chief of intelligence took a machine gun. The commanding general's own Vietnamese guard had been doubled weeks before, at his villa and on his drives through the city, after a report at the turn of the year that he had been marked for killing. That is a precaution against one man being shot. It is a different sort of precaution from the one a city takes against being walked into. What the whole arrangement stood against was terror, and it had been built over years to stand against exactly that. The command's own history says as much without softening it. To the very end, it gave little sign of expecting anything in Saigon beyond a rise in Viet Cong terrorism. A charge left in a doorway, a grenade under a table, a man on foot at a gate at an hour when the street is busy. Those were real questions, asked many times already. And the towers and the checkpoints and the men at the doors were the answers the city had worked out for them. So the paper was not the problem, and the reading of it was not really the problem either. Somebody had written down very nearly all of it. The regiments on the move, the newer weapons, the intention to enter the cities during the holiday, the tapes recorded in advance for a broadcast that had not happened. All of it had been read, weighed against the rest, and set down in the order it seemed to deserve. The last of it went onto the stack on the 30th of January, which was an ordinary day, and the evening that followed was an ordinary evening. The clearest record of the last ordinary day in Saigon belongs to the man with the largest office in it, because his hours were written down, and yours were not. He spent part of the 30th of January on the telephone with the ambassador and with his commanders, talking about the attacks in the north and about the alert that had gone out because of them. He sat in on part of a briefing about losses at the post exchanges. He met the new head of a magazine Saigon bureau. At noon he played a game of tennis. There is nothing in that day anyone would keep. That is the whole value of it. A report on losses at the shops, a new correspondent to shake hands with, an hour of tennis in the heat, and a great deal of telephone. He returned to his rented villa late in the evening and went to bed. The city he drove through was closing the way it closed every night, which is to say partly, unevenly, and by habit, more than by order. Cities behave that way on their own. Shutters come down at different hours in different streets. One block empties while the next one fills. The men whose occupation was to be out in it thought of the night as a block of time with edges, and the battalion's own paperwork, written more than a year before, had given those edges numbers. The critical hours ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. How much of the closing was law and how much was habit is not something the records will tell you now. The documents of the garrison do not record the hours of the Saigon curfew. They record the curfews of other towns, in other provinces, on other nights. But the hour at which Saigon itself was supposed to be indoors is not written in them anywhere. What they do record is what a curfew was as a piece of machinery. The power to declare one belonged to the President of the Republic. Once it was declared, it became something other people were told to watch. The plan for defending the cities gave the self-defense program the work of thickening the warning nets, holding the control points on the ways in, and reporting violations of the curfew among the signs that something was moving. And it stopped work as well as people. Vietnamese laborers on the American construction sites went home when a curfew was announced, the same as they went home for a strike. Elsewhere that week, other towns closed hard and on the record. In one coastal city, the province chief imposed a curfew, canceled leave, and declared the place off limits to American personnel. Out on the highways, the pattern was older than the war. As dusk came on, traffic was stopped and the curfew went on. The hamlet gates were locked, and the positions were made ready for whatever the dark brought. Saigon did none of that on the 30th of January. What Saigon did instead was hold a holiday. For the first time in years, the firecrackers were legal. The government had banned them. This year the ban was lifted, and the city was loud with them. The crowds were out. The noise came in strings and clusters out of courtyards and alleys and rooftops, the way it is supposed to at the turning of a year, and it continued well past any hour a man would call late. The alert was real, and it had gone out that day to every American in the country, with a warning to be ready for attacks that same night. Warnings of that kind had been issued before, and the bulletins had been coming for weeks. Men read them and continued with the evening, which is what men do with bulletins. Your own evening, if the roster had left you off a post, was the evening of a man quartered in a rented building in a city at a holiday. Most of the battalion was not out on the street at all, and never had been. In the report it had written more than a year earlier, approximately 70 of every 100 men were committed to guarding American installations, offices, and billets rather than patrolling, and the shape of that had not changed since. That guard strength had been thinning all quarter in the most ordinary way there is. A security platoon attached to the battalion from the area command had come down to 2 men over those months, not from any night's work, but from men reaching the end of their tours and the end of their enlistments and going home. The battalion set the number down among the other administrative facts of the quarter, between the driving hours and the requests for extensions. And a man out in the city that evening was not only his own army's business. A national policeman could stop him, and so could a joint patrol. The standing instruction was to comply and to cooperate, to give a name and a unit, to go along to the station if that was asked, and the duty allowed it, and under no circumstances to resist a national policeman with force. Afterwards you told your own military police what had happened, and somebody wrote that down too. There was a hazard in those buildings that had nothing to do with the enemy, and the battalion had been writing about it for a long time. More than 100 sets of quarters for officers and enlisted men stood scattered through every district of the city, some in clusters, and some entirely alone. The people who lived in them had picked up weapons of all sizes and descriptions, from every kind of source, and on a dark night nervous men, a good many of them with no training whatever, would fire at movement. There had been many nights when loose, uncoordinated shooting went out from the American quarters and from the civilian hotels into the streets, at buildings and rooftops and vehicles and alleys, and at friendly troops, at the National Police, at the Military Police. The battalion put it in writing that at times the danger from that source was greater than the danger from the enemy, and that this was truest in the hours of darkness. So part of what the guard did on an ordinary night was drive from billet to billet and ask the residents to stop. Military policemen went around warning them that friendly Vietnamese troops and the National Police were operating in their neighborhood and that they had to be careful. Getting the word to everybody turned out to be impossible. The firing continued after the warnings. The drive between the buildings was often the dangerous part of it, and the problem was never solved. Some of the buildings the military police did not know about at all. Calls came in from government quarters, private villas, and civilian billets that appeared on no list the battalion held, and locating them, entering them, and covering them was harder than it should have been. The buildings were simply too widely scattered. That was the ordinary hazard of an ordinary night, and by the standards of the city, this was a quiet holiday. The noise outside was fireworks, and it was supposed to be. The alert was on paper, and the paper had said that whatever was coming would most likely come after the holiday rather than during it. Men went to sleep in rented rooms across 100 addresses. The noise outside was fireworks, and it had been fireworks all evening, and it was still fireworks when the last of them stopped listening to it. For most of that night the city sounded the way a city sounds when something good is happening. Firecrackers exploded in long strings and in single flattened cracks, on balconies, in doorways, out of the backs of parked scooters, in alleys whose names you had never learned, and had no reason to learn. If you stood a post that night, that was the sound you stood in, and it asked nothing of you. A holiday you had been hearing about for weeks had arrived on the hour it was supposed to arrive, and it was making the noise you had been told it would make. A sound explained in advance stops being information. It turns into a condition of the evening, continuing behind whatever you are actually doing, noticed about as often as traffic is noticed behind a conversation. Not all of the city was making that noise. Around the headquarters compound, the streets were empty that evening, not quiet in the manner of a street going quiet late, but genuinely empty, and a staff officer who walked out for a late dinner noticed it and remembered afterward that he had noticed it. The same city held both conditions at the same hour, a crowd in one set of blocks, and nobody at all in another. Other arrangements had been made that evening by people whose whole profession was this city. 6,000 municipal policemen had been ordered to spend the night inside their own precinct stations instead of going home. The order had a reason behind it that was 2 days old. Reports had reached the director of the National Police on the 29th that Viet Cong special action units had infiltrated the city. He distributed additional ammunition and machine guns to the units guarding installations and checkpoints, put more patrols on the streets, and told his policemen to stay where they were until morning, beyond the city limits, in the province that wrapped around it. All 30 regional force companies and all 144 popular force platoons stayed on duty through the night at the highway checkpoints and at the hamlet guard posts along the edges of villages. The commander of the capital military district, the security zone that took in Saigon, and 5 neighboring districts of that province, sent 4 ranger battalions, a marine battalion, and a reconnaissance battalion out to establish night ambush positions on the likely infiltration routes around the capital. That is what a night ambush consists of. Men lying still in the dark, off the shoulder of a road that somebody else might decide to use. The military schools inside the same zone were told a version of the same thing. At the Marine School, the Reserve Officers School, the Armored and the Artillery and the Engineer Training Commands, and the Infantry Center out at Quang Trung, the senior officers instructed every soldier on the post to take part in the defense of that post. These were schools. On an ordinary night, the men on them were students and instructors and clerks and cooks, and on this night they were informed that they were also the garrison of the ground they were standing on. So a great many watchful, armed people were inside that night, and very nearly all of them were facing outward. Precinct houses, highway checkpoints, hamlet posts, ambush positions on the approach roads, schools told to hold their own fences. Every one of those arrangements was constructed on the same expectation, which was that whatever came would come from somewhere else and would have to cross something in order to arrive. None of it was arranged around the center of the city. The center of the city contained a park, 6 acres enclosed, with the Independence Palace standing inside the enclosure, and on the same ground, the private residence of the President of South Vietnam. 6 acres in the middle of a dense city is a large quantity of nothing. It is lawn and driveway and distance, and the distance is the entire point. The ground itself holds the street back from the building at the center of it. A wall can run continuous, but a wall that automobiles pass through cannot. Gates are the places where the logic of an enclosure has to be interrupted on purpose, and they are therefore the places anybody considering an enclosure considers first. The park had gates for automobiles, and one of them was on the south side. It was a lattice of metal, shut for the night, the kind of gate that is a barrier and a window at the same time. Bars, with a street on one side and 6 acres of lawn, and lit stone on the other, and everything on both sides plainly visible through. A lattice is meant to be looked through in both directions, so that the men inside can watch the street, and so that anybody on the street can see that the place is held. Across the street from it, an apartment building stood unfinished, in the condition a growing city leaves such buildings in for a season. At 2:45, the 31st of January, the first dark hours of the new year, 3 automobiles came up to that gate and stopped. 3 automobiles pulling up to a gate is not, in itself, anything whatever. Automobiles stop at gates. That is the entire function of a gate. And the guards standing at this particular one had watched automobiles stop there on every shift they had ever worked, and had walked up to the drivers, and had examined papers, and had waved most of them through. 14 people climbed out, one of them a woman. They were dressed in ordinary civilian clothing, the clothing of the evening the city had just finished spending, and at that hour, at that distance, there was nothing about 14 people in ordinary clothes to distinguish them from any other 14 people out late on a holiday. Guards were standing at the closed gate, where guards stood every night of the year. Through the bars, the palace was lit. That is a small circumstance, and it belongs in the record anyway. A government building is illuminated at night because a government building is illuminated at night. It was lit for precisely the reason it had been lit the evening before, and that reason had nothing to do with anybody standing outside the gate looking in at it. On this one night, the lighting told 14 people exactly where the building stood, how far back from the gate it sat, and which way the ground ran. You were not at that gate, and almost nobody in the American garrison was. You were somewhere else in the city, in one of the buildings the army had leased and never given back, with a fan and a door, and a single soldier standing at that door. Most of the garrison was asleep at that minute, which is the correct thing to be at that minute. The men who were not asleep were on posts, in 1s and 2s, at doorways and gateways and vehicle parks across a city that had no perimeter of any kind and had never required one. The hour would be written down later in a report, and later again in a bound volume, with a map reference printed beside it. That night it was simply the hour, carrying no more weight in it than the hours on either side of it. Nothing had reached you yet that was addressed to you. Whatever had begun at the south gate of a 6-acre park had not yet been given a name by anybody who would have to answer for it. 3 blocks to the east of that park gate there was a compound, and the first fact about the compound was its wall. Concrete, 2 meters high, carried the whole way around the grounds without a break, except where it had been deliberately broken. If you served in this city, you had gone past that wall, on foot or in a vehicle, and you had seen what everybody outside it saw, which was concrete, and above the concrete, the upper floors of a building set a long way back from the street. 2 meters is a decision, and it is a particular one. It is tall enough that nobody walking the sidewalk can see what is on the other side. It is not tall enough to seriously delay a person who has already decided to be on the other side of it. A wall of that height is built against the casual and the accidental, against the passer-by, the thrown object, the vehicle that wanders. And everybody who built it understood that this was what it was for. The wall was pierced in exactly 2 places, a pedestrian entrance on the southern side and a vehicle gate on the western side. Those 2 openings were the whole of the thinking. A gate is where a decision gets made about a person, and a compound with 2 gates is a compound with 2 places where anybody is obliged to be looked at. The remainder of the perimeter was surface, running along 4 streets, with nothing on it to examine and nobody standing at it. The compound itself was almost new. It had been completed in September of 1967, and it had replaced an earlier embassy, an office building downtown, part of which had been destroyed by a bomb in 1965. Nearly everything about the new place was an answer written to that bomb. It was, by the standards of the year, the most modern diplomatic compound the United States possessed anywhere. And the state-of-the-art then meant blast absorption, standoff distance, and hardened entry points. This compound had been given all 3. The Chancery building stood at the center of the grounds. 6 stories, rectangular, with a helicopter pad on the roof. Its outer surface was a white honeycomb shell, engineered to absorb the blast of mortar rounds and rockets. From the street, that shell read as architecture, the sort of ornament a country puts on a building to make it look like the country. It was not ornament. The main door on the ground floor was a thick slab of teakwood, and standing in front of the teakwood was a sturdy iron gate, heavy enough to deflect a grenade thrown at the doorway. A row of concrete planters was set out across the front lawn. A 2-story villa stood just east of the Chancery on the same ground, close enough that a man could walk between the 2 buildings in under a minute. Everything named so far is an answer to something arriving from outside. An explosive in a parked automobile. A round dropped down a tube from several streets away. A grenade thrown by an arm standing on a sidewalk. The compound had been designed with a direction in mind, and the direction was inward. Nothing in its design was an answer to people already standing on the grass. The northern side of the grounds was a parking lot, and that night, the lot was nearly empty. Several limousines were parked on it, and the Vietnamese drivers who belonged to those limousines were spending the night on call, in the cars, on the compound. Those drivers are worth a sentence of their own. They were not guards, and they were not staff. They drove automobiles for the embassy, and because of the hours the embassy kept, they slept on the property, rather than crossing a city at night to reach their own beds, and crossing it again before daylight. Inside the Chancery, the evening staff was very small. 3 United States Marine Guards, one of them positioned on the roof with a shotgun, and a handful of embassy staffers. That was the building. A working day put a great many people into those 6 stories. A holiday evening left in them fewer people than a visitor would ever have seen there. At the vehicle gate on the western side stood a pair of soldiers from the 716th Military Police Battalion, your battalion, and one of the ordinary night details. A man in it drew an important address, a gate, 2 of you, and an evening of standing in one place while a city celebrates on the other side of the wall. You had stood details like it at other addresses. Behind these 2 was a compound built to be difficult from a distance, and in front of them was a sidewalk. One thing was missing from outside the wall, and it had been there on ordinary nights. Several policemen of the South Vietnamese National Police from the precinct station nearby normally stood guard on the outside of the embassy. That night they were not there. The reason, as far as anybody could reconstruct it afterward, was Tet. An absence is the most difficult item on any list to notice. A man who is present is a thing you see. A man who is not present is nothing at all, occupying no space, making no sound, and requiring somebody to remember on his own that the space had previously been occupied on a holiday in a friendly capital, with the noise of a celebration coming over the wall, that remembering did not happen. The ambassador was asleep at his private residence, 8 blocks north of the compound. The senior American official on the grounds themselves that night was the man who lived in the 2-story villa beside the chancery, which is to say that the ranking person present was somebody who happened to keep his bed there. 30 minutes after 3 automobiles had stopped at the park gate across town, a taxi and a truck rolled up to the southeastern corner of this wall. A corner is not an opening. That corner was concrete meeting concrete, 2 meters of it with a sidewalk on the outside and a lawn on the inside, and neither of the 2 gates inside of it. Nothing had ever been checked at that corner, because a corner checks nothing. 15 people climbed out onto the sidewalk, and the taxi and the truck pulled away and drove off. For a moment, the whole of the arrangement on that street was 15 people standing on a pavement beside a wall, in a city where people had stood about on pavements all night. The 2 military policemen at the vehicle gate opened fire toward the corner, stepping back through the gate into the compound. As they did it, they pulled the metal gate shut behind them and locked it. Then they got on the radio to their battalion headquarters, and what they reported was that the embassy was under attack. That sentence contains one place and one condition, and nothing else whatever. It does not say how many. It does not say where along the wall. It does not say whether anybody is inside the concrete yet or still out on the pavement. It does not say whether the same thing is happening anywhere else in the city, and the men who sent it had no way of knowing that it was. At the other end of the radio, somebody wrote down the name of a compound and one word after it, and for the moment that was the entire contents of the night. The night did not arrive in a single place. It arrived in a dozen separate places inside half an hour, in districts of the city that had nothing whatever to do with one another. And it arrived at each of them as a purely local event, on a particular street, at a particular gate. A man standing at one of those addresses knew what was happening at that address. For hours after, that was all he knew. Everything else traveled by telephone. Saigon ran on switchboards and vehicle radios, and the ordinary lines running into offices and villas and police stations. And across that stretch of the morning, those instruments began ringing inside buildings that could not see one another. Every call carried a fragment. No call carried the shape of it. A man who took 3 calls in 10 minutes had 3 fragments, and knew no more than the man who took none. At 2:50 in the morning, the fighting reached the headquarters of the South Vietnamese Navy, on the embankment where the Saigon River runs past the center of town. That headquarters had been chosen the way the others were chosen, for what it held and where it stood, and the sailors inside it learned about the night in the ordinary way, which is to say from the sound of it arriving in their own courtyard. 2 blocks northeast at about the same moment, armed men entered the national radio station. Of everything in Saigon that could be captured that morning, the radio station was the only building able to speak to the whole country in one breath. The capital, the Delta, the Highlands, the coast, anybody with a set and the power to run it. The broadcast never went out. At the transmitting station on the outskirts, the duty officer worked out that the studio downtown was under attack, and he cut the line. Whatever tape had been carried in to be played was never played, and the one voice in Vietnam able to tell the city about itself inside a minute said nothing at all that morning. Everyone was left with the telephone. At 3 o'clock, the fighting reached the compound of the Joint General Staff. at gate number 5 on Voton Street. That compound held the headquarters of the entire South Vietnamese Army, and it stood inside the city like any other walled property on any other street, with numbered gates and a wall you could touch from the pavement, in a district where families lived. At 3:20, it reached Tan Son Nhut, at the bunkers beside Gate 51, on the western entrance to the airfield. The firing came from the north, from a textile factory 500 meters away, across the highway. The soldiers in those bunkers had been looking at that factory for months. It was part of the view from the post, the way a water tower or a tree line is part of the view from a post. Those places are not far apart. A car crosses between them in minutes along an empty street, and the streets were empty. The 35 minutes separating the earliest from the latest was not a march and not an advance. Nothing had traveled in from the countryside to arrive at those addresses in that order. Everything had been inside the city already, in rooms and courtyards and back lanes, waiting on a clock. The list was longer than the famous names on it, written down later in a report by officers with every call in front of them at once. It covered the embassy and the presidential palace and the radio station and the army headquarters, and after that it kept going. Police stations, billets, the rented buildings where Americans slept, scattered by the hundred through ordinary blocks, without wire around them, without a field of fire, without anything outside to tell them from the buildings on either side. Westward, in Cholon, where the Chinese quarter descends toward the canals, the fighting entered from the outskirts and continued arriving, into streets narrow enough that two vehicles could not pass together. Most of the garrison knew Cholon only as a district you drove through on the way somewhere else. The city's own policemen were already inside their stations. 6,000 municipal police had been ordered to spend the holiday night in their own station houses, on the strength of reports that had come in 2 days earlier about armed men getting into the city. Those station houses turned out to be among the addresses on the list. For the battalion of military police, the night did not arrive as a line drawn across a map in an operations room. It arrived as a telephone call. After that, another telephone call from a different quarter of town about something that did not obviously connect with the first. After that, a third, over a radio, from a soldier who had seen something from a doorway and could not say how much of it there was. Somewhere in that same stretch of the morning, in a villa across the city, an aide woke the commander of all American forces in Vietnam so that he could take a telephone call from his own headquarters. He learned about it the same way the sentry at the gate learned about it, and the switchboard operator learned about it. Somebody told him. What he was told was a fragment. Consider what a telephone call could carry that morning, and what it could not. It could carry an address if the man reporting knew the address. It could carry a direction, firing from the north, firing from beyond the road. It could seldom carry a number of men because nobody had counted them and nobody was going to. And it could not carry the one thing that mattered, which was whether the event at your address and the event at another man's address belonged to the same operation. The fragments also arrived in different orders, and the order decided what a man believed. If your first call was about the airfield, you decided that the airfield was the operation and everything else was noise around it. If your first call came from a billet downtown, you decided that downtown was the operation. Two men a kilometer apart, at the same minute, could hold pictures of Saigon that agreed nowhere. In a war with a front, information travels along the front. A unit hears the artillery to its left before the artillery reaches it, and the hearing is itself information. And by morning, the line on the map has moved a certain distance, and everybody can be told how far. Here there was no line for information to travel along. There were only telephones, ringing within the same few minutes inside buildings with no view of one another, every one of them about a street. What the garrison had for the whole of that half hour was not a battle with a beginning and a middle and an end. It was a set of telephone calls that did not add up until somebody else, somewhere else, a long time later, added them. Inside that half hour, each of those places had its own account of the night, and every account was accurate, and no two of them fitted into anything a man could act on. Joining them up would take days, and would happen at desks, done by officers with every call in front of them, working long afterward. The soldiers at the gates went on knowing their own streets. For most of that evening, the city had been noisier than it had been allowed to be for years. Firecrackers were legal again for this holiday, after a long government ban, and they had been going off since dark in strings and single cracks, and long rolling runs of them, in the street outside whatever building you were in. You had been listening to that sound for hours without listening to it at all. The way people stop hearing rain. Nobody in Saigon had to tell one sound from the other, and there was no moment of listening hard and deciding. Because what happened was simpler and stranger than that. The firecrackers ended at their own pace, the way they had been ending all evening, and in the place where they had been. There was another sound, everywhere in the city, and it was gunfire. By that hour, real firing had taken the place of the reports of firecrackers. A sound you have been discounting since dark does not tell you that it has become a different sound. It goes on sitting in the background until something makes you hear it a second time. And by that second hearing, it has already been the other sound for a long while. In many quarters, people woke and went to a window or a doorway and saw armed men on their own street. Not soldiers of any army they recognized, men in black pajamas and rubber sandals, carrying weapons, moving like people with somewhere to be. That was everything a household in those blocks knew at that hour. Armed strangers on this particular street. It tells you nothing whatever about the street behind yours. A soldier of the military police was standing his guard at a billet across from the numbered gate of the army headquarters, on a street he had watched on other nights without anything happening on it. He saw a brief exchange of fire in the alley beside him. He went inside the villa, locked the door behind him, and got on the radio to his battalion headquarters to report what he had seen. Nothing in that is a failure of nerve. He was a single man at a doorway, with a rifle, in the darkness, and he had no idea how many people were in that alley, or whose they were, or whether the business in his alley connected to anything else at all. What he could do was report it accurately. He locked a door and told somebody, which was the correct use of him. The trouble was what the report ran into. Most of the telephones in the city were dead. The few remaining were hopelessly overworked, with too many people needing them for too many things. And the battalion later wrote, in a flat sentence in an official report, that intelligence information outside their own internal sources did not exist, not scarce and not slow, absent altogether. They had not been left out of the defense plan by accident, because there was no plan that included them. The battalion was in no scheme for the defense of Saigon, had no chain of command reaching upward for a night like this one, and had no signal channel of its own. So the headquarters found things out by monitoring its own military police net, listening to its own patrols talking to each other, and by ringing up various installations around the city to ask whether anything was happening where they were, which meant that the men at the fixed posts became the intelligence service. The battalion said as much afterward. In fighting inside a city, the best sources of information about what is going on are the patrols and the static posts with radios scattered through every district, each man reporting his own 100 meters, and the picture put together out of 100 separate 100-meter reports, arriving out of order from men who could not see one another. After that, the telephone calls began coming the other way. Requests for military police from government billets nobody at headquarters had a record of, from civilian villas, from hotels and private houses full of people who had every reason to want somebody to come. In many cases, the location of the building was unknown, and in some cases the existence of the building was unknown. Men were sent to find addresses that were on no list they had. The maps were no help either. The battalion said flatly afterward that its city maps were not detailed enough and not accurate enough, that pinpointing a location was difficult, that a great many roads and alleys and buildings were not shown in any useful detail. Over a radio, in the darkness, that becomes its own kind of blindness. Where the firing comes from, where it is going, which way to come in. The darkness was a technical problem before it was anything else. A reaction team on its way somewhere that morning turned the wrong way, probably unfamiliar with that quarter of town, and the report adds the thing that made it worse, which was the darkness, which made the street signs difficult to read. Not darkness as an atmosphere, but darkness as the reason a man could not read the name of a street from a moving vehicle. And arriving did not resolve the questions either. Policemen who reached one alley established that a dozen or more armed men were inside the houses along it, and the account stops there, because nobody could say which houses, not which floor, and not which room, which building on the lane. That is the condition men were working in for most of that morning. So the first order that went out from the battalion commander was not an order to attack anything. Having taken a distress call, he dispatched several jeep patrols to find out what was going on. And that is the sentence in the record. The first task was not to win anything, but to establish what was happening in a city where the answer arrived one street at a time. The patrols that went out later knew more than the first ones had, and it changed the way they moved. They stopped parking in front of buildings, leaving the vehicles a block short, and coming the rest of the way on foot, quietly, looking, because by then they had learned that driving up to a place nobody had seen was how you discovered what was inside it. In the nights that followed, the misunderstanding pointed the other way. More than 100 billets held people who had never expected to defend a building. Weapons were handed out to them from wherever they could be found, and in the darkness they fired at whatever moved under their windows. What they fired at included vehicles, policemen of the National Police, military policemen, and other billets doing the same thing. The battalion recorded that on some nights this was the more dangerous of the two, and that darkness was what made it so. An hour into it, standing anywhere in Saigon, you knew that the sound had changed, and that there were armed men somewhere near you, and that the telephone on the desk behind you was either dead or occupied. What you did not know was the size of it, or the shape of it, or whether the thing happening on your own street was happening anywhere else at all. For the man standing at a door somewhere in the city, the arrival of light did not come with a relief detail. Getting to a post meant driving to it, across streets that were not all crossable. Where fire made a post unreachable, the man on that post stayed on it. The battalion later wrote down what it had failed to deliver to those men, and it wrote the 3 things in the order they were missed: rations, ammunition, and relief. So the first thing daylight gave was not a view of the city. It was the ability to move through it, and even that came with a rule. From that morning on, no single vehicle was allowed to move anywhere in Saigon. Not on patrol, not on an errand, not to carry a message across town. Military police work everywhere in the world had been built around the one-car patrol. What went out instead was a pair of vehicles, at least 3 armed men in each, counted as one unit that did not split up. If you were in one of those vehicles that morning, you were looking at streets you had driven past for months, and some of what was in them was new. In many neighborhoods, people had woken to find armed strangers standing in their own street, in black pajamas and rubber sandals. That is the picture the record keeps of the first morning, not a line on a map, not a front, not a direction the trouble had come from. Householders opening a door onto their own block and finding men who had not been there the day before. And the light found some of the city's installations being held by men whose job was not holding anything. Out in the western districts, the motor pool was still in the hands of its own mechanics and drivers. The commissary and the store compound beside it were still being covered by clerks and food storage specialists who had picked up weapons the evening before and had not yet put them down. The noise did not stop when the light came. Through the morning, heavy firing could be heard across the city, and much of it was now being made from above. Helicopter gunships and tactical aircraft working over the places where the attackers had put themselves. Light did not make the city quiet. It changed which weapons were making the sound, and it moved that sound higher up. At the headquarters compound out by the airfield, the light showed something that had happened in the corridors. The staff on duty overnight had heard the reports coming in from all over the country, had heard gunfire close by, and had improvised a thin perimeter around a building that had never been fortified. It was manned by clerks and military police, led by junior staff officers, all of them frightened, all of them doing it for the first time. Inside the building, other men had dragged desks out into the corridors and lined them up as a last barricade. In the morning, the desks were still there. They had not been tested, and they would not be. What daylight showed in that corridor was not an enemy and not damage. It was a row of office furniture pushed into a line by people who had spent the night believing they would have to use it. The officers who drove into that headquarters in the morning arrived with stories about the drive. It was the same route they took on any other day, through a city that had changed category overnight, and for days afterward the compound itself took the occasional sniper round and the occasional mortar round, which is not a battle and is not nothing, and which the people working there learned to carry on through. The one thing that did not stop with the light was the firing out of the billets, and by day it changed meaning. Men who had been handed weapons in the dark went on shooting at movement in the street below them, and by then much of the movement was their own side. Soldiers walking a block that had already been walked, national police in their own city, military police in marked jeeps. Somebody had to be sent from building to building to say so out loud, and the saying of it took men who were needed in other places. The command arrangements changed while it was still dark, and by the middle of the morning the change was on the ground. A forward tactical command post was set up beside the South Vietnamese headquarters for the Capital District to take control of the American units now coming into the Saigon area. A city that had gone to bed as a rear area woke up with a tactical headquarters standing in it. Something else arrived with the light that the battalion had never had, which was infantry. Rifle companies were attached to it for police operations, and that is an odd sentence in both directions. The military police crews knew the streets, the alleys, the way into a courtyard, and which turn out of it was one way. The attached soldiers brought weapons a police battalion does not own. For the rest of that week the two worked as one thing, and neither of them had been trained for the other's half of it. The city's own police were in the same position, and worse supplied. It had always been assumed that the national police would carry themselves through an emergency on their own stock. During the fighting, they asked the American battalion for help, and were given it. 160 cases of rations, along with hand grenades, rifle ammunition, and carbine ammunition, issued out of a supply that had not been built to feed anybody else. Fuel moved under escort from that morning on. Tanker convoys carrying gasoline to the power plants and out to the airbase ran with an armored car and company and a pair of machine gun jeeps, because the power plants had to keep running and the route to them went through ordinary streets. Whatever else the city was that day, it was still a city that needed its lights on in the evening, and the arithmetic of the battalion got worse in daylight rather than better. Patrols had doubled because no vehicle moved alone. Guard commitments had grown because buildings that had never asked for a guard were asking now. Every one of those decisions was correct, and every one of them took men and vehicles out of the pool the battalion held back for answering calls. The longer it went on, the thinner the part of it that could go anywhere. Some vehicles did not come back at all, and others came back needing work that could not be done quickly. What the battalion asked for afterward was small and practical. A maintenance float, which is a handful of spare vehicles held aside to replace what gets destroyed. A police battalion in a city is a fleet before it is anything else, and a fleet with nothing in reserve gets smaller one truck at a time, and none of it had a number yet. Nobody had counted the buildings or the hours men had spent on posts that could not be reached, or what the night had cost the battalion. All of that would be gathered later by people sitting down with paper, doing arithmetic the first morning had no time for. That paper came a week later. The paper came on the 8th of February. It was written at battalion headquarters, and it carried a subject line rather than a title. Special Report. During combat conditions, City of Saigon, the 31st of January to the 4th of February, 1968. It was stamped confidential, to be downgraded at 3-year intervals and declassified after 12 years. Inside it there are numbered observations, and under each one a recommendation. What the unit was, in its own accounting: 1,300 military policemen. Few of them had ever seen combat, and none of them had received training for fighting inside a city. Nothing else the Army kept in the capital was organized to fight. The heaviest thing it owned was a few recoilless rifles that it had no authority to hold ammunition for. Some was obtained once the shooting had started. The emergency plan the battalion had been given contained one sentence that the report quotes against itself. There is no provision in the plan, it says, for use of battalion military policemen as fighting units. What it was holding? Roughly 83% of its police and guard strength was tied up in guarding places. The embassy, the new headquarters complex, senior officers' quarters, the billets, of which there were more than 100, standing in clusters and standing alone in every section of the city. On the first night, the battalion was guarding 130 separate facilities. Before the 5th day was out, it had either sent reaction forces to, or taken on the security of, about 30 more. What came at the city that night? In the other reports, of the 54 main and local force battalions in the core area, 35 went into the opening attack across the region. 11 of them, at a combined strength of 3,000 to 4,000 men, were committed against Saigon itself. 7 of the 11 were local units whose home ground was already in and around the capital. Their weapons had come in earlier on produce trucks and been hidden in caches through the city. Some North Vietnamese units marched the last stretch on foot, a few of them 12 continuous hours on the final night. Against that, by midnight of the 31st, the Americans and the South Vietnamese had brought more maneuver battalions into the capital district than the other side had put into its initial assault. The first day, by the clock. At 6:30 in the morning, a company of South Vietnamese paratroopers and several light tanks reached the national radio station. Resistance in the building lasted about 3 hours more. At the embassy, the assault went in at around 8 o'clock, against a force by then reduced to 6 or 8 men still able to fight. At 9, the embassy staff declared the compound secure. A quarter of an hour later, the commanding general arrived by car, and the ambassador a few minutes after him. They could see that the chancery had suffered little more than cosmetic damage, and the ambassador ordered the building open for business that same afternoon. By the 2nd of February, the major attempt to capture the city appeared to be broken. What the 4 days changed, the battalion listed as corrections. The alert force of 25 men, sent all at once into an unknown situation in a built-up area, had proved unwieldy and dangerous. Teams of 11 to 13 replaced it. The 2.5-ton truck was out, and 3/4-ton trucks took its place. The single-vehicle patrol was gone. 2 armored commando cars, sent over by the military police group, spent the 4 days carrying ammunition to units that could not be reached any other way, and pulling out crews who were pinned down. Each team turned out to need a machine gun and a grenade launcher it had not been issued. With them, pinned teams could get themselves out. Reinforcement came through channels that worked. 2 platoons from another military police battalion arrived to strengthen the company at the headquarters complex. Supplies came in first by helicopter, and afterward by escorted supply vehicles from the group. Had the operational channels been as clearly defined as the administrative ones, the report says the battalion would have been in a far better posture. What did not work, the report is equally plain about. All telephone communication between battalion headquarters and the quarters holding 3 of its companies failed soon after the fighting began, and those companies had to run jeep radios to talk to the battalion at all. Everything went by radio after that. Intelligence, the report says, was non-existent outside the battalion's own internal sources. The battalion appeared in no plan for the defense of the city and had no channel upward, so it learned what was happening by monitoring its own police net, and the city maps were not accurate enough to say where anything was. Men and supply. In many cases, the report says, personnel remained on a static post for 36 hours because hostile fire made it impossible to get to the post. Resupplying those posts and relieving the men on them is named in the report as the second problem. the scattering of the billets created. Its own losses appear once, and they appear as a supply problem. A great shortage of equipment exists in the battalion, it says, because of the large number of personnel killed or wounded on the 31st of January. The equipment was destroyed or lost through no fault of those men. The battalion was required to report its casualties within 12 hours, and could not. In the first day, the tactical situation did not permit it. The report also asks for something that reads oddly in a paper about a battle: that the battalion commander be made provost marshal as well, or that somebody write down who commands this unit in a case like this one. The provost marshal was a staff officer with no command function, unfamiliar, the report says, with what the unit could and could not do. The recommendations run to a page. Move as many people out of Saigon as the relocation program allows. Consolidate the rest into places that can actually be defended. Give each of those places a guard force, squad to platoon, billeted on site, with enough ammunition and rations to hold on its own for a long time. Give every building a defense plan, weapons under the control of a senior occupant, a radio on a common net, and rules about opening fire. Vacate the quarters holding 3 of the 5 companies, 1 entrance and exit, 1 approach road, 1 narrow way out, and if it had been taken or burned, 3/5 of the battalion would have been cut off. Update the maps until better maps can be had. The same quarterly report carries its ordinary columns, covering November through January. Its drivers put over 600,000 miles on the odometers at a cost of 36 wrecks, none fatal. 213 men took rest leave abroad, and 8 took it in country. 57 asked to extend their tours and were allowed to. 16 Bronze Stars and 30 Commendation Medals were awarded for meritorious service. On or about the 4th of February, the tactical commitments began to diminish, and the borrowed platoons went back to their own battalion. Then the requests started coming in: extra guards, armed escorts, traffic control points. The battalion found itself overcommitted again, and went back to the group to ask for more men. That is where the report stops, not on a conclusion, on a request for reinforcements for an ordinary week's work. Nothing about the day you have just spent was supposed to be remembered. A man checked identification at a gate. A jeep went out on a route it had run 100 times. Somebody signed for a block of ice. And somebody else argued about a traffic accident on a street with too much traffic on it. And a truck came in from the port with food that had to be kept cold, and mostly was. That is what the garrison of a rear city does with its year. It is the part of a war that nobody films, because there is nothing in it to point a camera at. And then a holiday arrived, and the war turned out to have been in the city the whole time. What happened afterward is a matter of record, and it is not really what tonight was about. The fighting in Saigon went on for days, and in Cholon longer than that. The city was cleared block by people who had never expected to fight in it. The battalion whose shift you have been standing wrote its report a week later, in the flat language that reports are written in, and the report is how we know most of what you have just heard. The interesting thing about that report is what it asks for. It asks for internal defense plans for the buildings. It asks that weapons be held under the control of the senior man in each billet, not one for everybody, roughly one for every 10 occupants. It asks for a radio in each building on a common net, so that a man standing at a door in the dark can tell somebody what he is hearing. It asks for clear rules about when to open fire. Read that list again and you will see the shape of the night in the negative. Every one of those things is a recommendation, which means that on the last night of January, in more than 100 buildings scattered across a city with no perimeter, none of them existed. There was a man and a door, and a light above it, and whatever he had been issued, and no way to ask anyone what was happening 50 meters away. That is what changed. Not the maps. The maps changed too, but that is a different program. What changed for the people in this story is small and domestic and permanent. The doors got locked. The buildings got plans. Sandbags went up around entrances that had never needed them, and wire went across streets that had been ordinary streets, and the rear stopped being a place and became a word that nobody in that city used with any confidence again. There is a habit of mind that goes with living in a safe place. You stop hearing the noise. Firecrackers had been going off for hours, and they were only firecrackers, and everyone knew that, and everyone was right until about 2:45 in the morning. Afterwards, for the rest of that tour, and for tours after it, men in that city listened to ordinary sounds differently. That is the whole of it. That is what the night did. The report does not say what any of that was like. Reports do not. It uses the word personnel for people, and it uses the word incident for a night that several hundred men spent discovering, one building at a time, that there was nothing behind them. Somewhere underneath that language is a man who locked a door and stood behind it in the dark and had no way to tell anybody what he could hear. The report is the only place he is written down at all, and he is written down as a resource, and it is still the reason we know he was there. The buildings are still there. Some of them are hotels again, with different names. The gate the 3 cars pulled up to is a gate in a working city, and people walk past it on their way to somewhere. And the 6 acres behind it are a park with paths through them the way parks are. The airfield is an airport. The street where the joint patrols worked is a street. None of that is remarkable. That is rather the point. A city goes back to being a city faster than anything else in a war goes back to being what it was. And the men who stood in the doorways of it went home at the end of their year, one at a time, in the order that their orders came. That is enough for tonight. If you made it this far awake, that was not the idea. Sleep well. The long watch will be here tomorrow night.